Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us for this panel on radicalisation and rabbit holes, conspiracy theory and the like, how people end up in them and how to get them back out again. It's a pleasure to be chairing this panel, and for this panel we've got some really excellent contributors who are going to bring a lot of experience and interesting perspectives to this topic, I think. So first of all, I'd like them to introduce themselves, if you don't mind, and we'll start from the far end of the table there.
Oh, hi, I'm Ema Sullivan-Bissett. I'm a philosopher at the University of Birmingham, and I work mainly on philosophy of mind and psychology, implicit bias, delusion, conspiracy theories, that kind of thing.
My name is Rabinowitz. I'm a philosopher. Is that better?
Yeah, there we go.
There we go.
Okay.
I'm Aaron Rabinowitz. I have a philosophy background, and I'm currently working on a PhD in moral education. I'm obsessed with luck and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories.
I'm Rachel Schraer. I'm a health and disinformation reporter at the BBC, and so I covered the anti-vaccine movement, climate denial, and all sorts of ways that people misuse science and data.
And then from my side, I'm Michael Arsh. I'm the editor of The Skeptic magazine. I spent a couple of years working, looking at the flat Earth movement. I spent time in the anti-vaccination movement too. And so this is our panel. And so, Emma, if I could start with you. You're one of the projects that you're lead researcher on. It looks at conspiratorial ideation, pathological belief. So could you just briefly explain what do we mean by conspiratorial ideation, and are there particular traits or markers that make people susceptible to things like this?
Yeah, good, thanks. So, yeah, we're really interested in particular in thinking about whether it makes sense to think about conspiratorial ideation in pathological terms. And what's really striking about the research in this area is that psychologists kind of look at the profile of people who tend to believe in conspiracy theories, and they talk about the kinds of biases that sort of prompt those explanations, things like intentionality bias, so seeing intention where there isn't any, proportionality bias, so attributing big causes to big events. But what they don't do is say, these are abnormal ways to think about things, right? They're perfectly ordinary ways of responding to evidence. They're not particularly rational, but they're kind of ordinary. And what we want to do in the project is think about whether that makes sense, right? Because when we think about other irrational beliefs, like delusions, the tendency there is for psychologists to say, okay, which clinically significant, horrible irrationality is going on to explain how people are getting there? And so what we're up to there is trying to think about whether it makes sense to approach these two things quite so radically differently.
Yeah, and the idea of looking at conspiracy theory and the way that people end up in those places being essentially normal things, not good things, but normal things. Right. It certainly does feel that over the last few years in particular, conspiracy theory has become normalised. And I guess, Rachel, this comes into a lot of the work that you're doing. So from your perspective, in all the health misinformation that you're tracking and various things in those areas, what would you say from on the ground the modern conspiracy theory ecosystem actually looks like, the landscape?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess before I get into that, I just wanted to say, thinking about these traits as kind of a good or a bad thing, what I often think about is the way that some of the traits that make someone go down the conspiracy theory route are actually very similar to the traits that make someone like an investigative journalist or an activist. And so we don't necessarily need to make those negative things. It's someone often who is like very curious, who's like worried about power systems, who's concerned about the forces of power and authority. And so there's an interesting thing there about how we harness that. But in terms of what the landscape looks like now, and I mean, I spoke about it earlier, but what I've really seen completely explode is the use of data, scientific papers, real bits of evidence to kind of bolster and create a very specific worldview. But also, I guess, what is unique or different now to 20 years ago is the extremely networked nature of it all, the way that you can very closely, and it sounds trite at this point to talk about social media in this way, but you can very closely connect to so many people on different sides of the world. You can get very involved in a community, and then what I often see happen is people jump from like a Facebook group to a Telegram group to another Telegram group, and it gets linked and shared and shared. And if you're someone monitoring that, you almost follow that process and replicate that process of the way that people go from something that might be, I'm not very happy with lockdown, let's all talk about that, to a much more extreme Telegram group, to another, and down until eventually you almost always reach, white supremacy or some version of that, basically.
I thought you were either going to say white supremacy or anti-Semitism, at which point I was going to say, Aaron, you do a lot of research. Aaron, as an anti-Semitism researcher, specifically is what I'm saying here, to be clear.
I can do both.
Do you want to talk about your experience when you see of this kind of conspiracy theory landscape?
Yeah, and I think it's really complicated. One of the other things that I'm particularly interested in is moral panics, which are often tied to conspiracy theories. And there has been some work by a researcher that got mentioned actually at the Thursday night meeting about some pushback and some suggestion that there is actually a moral panic about conspiratorial ideation, that we don't actually see a significant increase in the data. We can maybe talk about that separately, but like, I think it's very complicated to know what the actual landscape looks like, because the media definitely treats this like another thing that it can, gin up an interest by scaring people about. But I also think there is a significant new problem that is emerging, and that the data is not necessarily effectively capturing that. And the sort of things that Rachel's describing, I see all the time online. If y'all are familiar with the intellectual dark web, for example, many of the leaders of the intellectual dark web spiraled off into conspiracism pretty quickly and took a fair number of people with them. And it does often take the form of this, I start with a reasonable concern, somebody freaks out at me online about it, and then I move to increasingly unreasonable concerns because of that reaction.
Yeah, and I think, so from my perspective, what I've seen is very similar to that. It's the same kind of experience, but what we see is kind of, there is something, an inciting incident which gets someone into that initial rabbit hole, but getting them back out once people are in there, it's really difficult to disentangle it, because once you believe in one particular conspiracy theory, you're going to believe in all these other different conspiracy theories too. And I think for me, the modern landscape that I've watched kind of change over the last 10 years of being involved in skepticism, I remember it used to be that conspiracy theories felt quite discreet. 9/11 was an inside job. The moon landing was faked. But now it seems more and more that there is a conspiracy theory that's just an aspect of, and these grand overarching narratives, these conspiracy theories, as you wrote for The Skeptic, Aaron. I don't know what the panel think of that. Have you got the same kind of experience of these interlocking narratives into this one grand global picture of kind of malevolent control by the unseen?
Yeah, I certainly see that, and I think on the one hand, the idea that there are kind of dark forces or elites in control, up to no good, is not a new thing at all. But definitely, I think that I have seen some of that shift, and I think it again comes down to how very networked these communities are, because it might be that you existed in one community over here that wasn't particularly connected. Your feeling about 9/11 wouldn't be particularly connected to climate denial, whereas now, if you're going in to say, again, to use the example of lockdowns, I don't like lockdown, then COVID is a hoax, then, I think they might be bringing in climate lockdowns, and then you're onto climate denial. And because these communities are so much more networked than ever before, it's much easier for people to slide from one to the other. And then almost, this is like not based on evidence at all, this is just my own hunch, but I almost feel like once you've accumulated that many beliefs, it can only be rational to say there must be some grand conspiracy organising all of it, because if all of these things are going on, and there's climate lockdowns, and there's this, and there's that, and this was an inside job, suddenly there must be this grand conspiracy, otherwise how can it all make sense?
Yeah.
And people want things to make sense.
Anyone else want to come in on that?
Well, I mean, one really obvious thing to say is that if you want to maintain the kind of intellectual stability of your conspiracy theory, and you don't want to wind up in cognitive dissonance, then you better accept a load of others, right? Because once the counter-evidence starts coming in, you need to be able to tell a story about why that counter-evidence is rubbish, right? So if I believe that the Earth is flat, then I also need to believe that the moon landing was faked. And I also need to believe that NASA are like full of dodgy criminals, right? And so these things just roll on and roll on and roll on. And that seems to me that in order to maintain the initial stability of the thing that you started with, you just end up with this kind of snowball effect, right?
Yeah, and this is a particularly hard problem with conspiracy theories for a couple of reasons. One, it's difficult to get a definition of conspiracy theories that is neutral enough that most people will accept, and that doesn't, I would argue you go with a very neutral definition that includes things like birthday parties, which leads to some interesting discussions. So I think that there are, most people probably, I would guess, believe or are close to believing at least one conspiracy theory, but are not super likely to necessarily spiral. There are the other kind of factors that you mentioned that go into it. But I also think Emma's point is really important, that in the modern world, belief in conspiracy theories is not irrational, in my opinion. It's not healthy, it's not good, but if I think the most driving force behind a lot of conspiracism I see is just better understanding the history of settler colonialism and the ongoing exploitation of marginalized individuals. Conspiracy theorists will often point to actual real conspiracies that have been proven by, governments, by pharma, by places like that. And if you have that evidence, it is not totally implausible to then move to other similar views.
Yeah, but when we have that, it may not be implausible to move to other views, but the more time you do spend in these places, the more time you move to further and further implausible views and further extremist views.
Well, so the problem I want to mention about the definition is some people have tried to say that you can tell between good and bad conspiracy theories because of the level of plausibility. But if you buy this idea that the government is hiding significant information, there's no way to distinguish what's an implausible conspiracy theory. Everything is on the table because, the evidence is being hidden.
Yeah. And so we've looked a little bit at how people accumulate based on sort of time in conspiracy theory. But Rachel, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, so that you mentioned the networking and the technological factors. Could you talk a little bit about how people accumulate conspiracy theories and conspiracy theory friends and community through those factors? Because I think a lot of people here won't know when you say Telegram exactly what that means to be in and what the experience of being on Telegram in a conspiracy channel is like.
Yeah, I kind of forget. I feel like I spend so much time there that sometimes I forget, and then I'm just talking to my normal friends, and they're like, "What is Telegram?" And I'm like, "Oh yeah, normal people don't use." Or in this country, I should say, there are lots of countries in the world that people do very commonly use Telegram, like they use WhatsApp. But yeah, so Telegram is an encrypted messaging app, but unlike with WhatsApp, you can search for and access public open groups. So you can chat to people, but also if I'm interested in Ukraine, I might go and try and find some groups. I'll join that public open group. There'll be all sorts of people in it, and then people cross-post from lots of other groups. So they will share something from another group, and I'll go, that looks interesting. Where did that come? Click through, you end up in the next group, you join that group. You see, oh, that's an interesting link. You follow through, you find the next. And that way you kind of end up involved in that sort of network. And I think what we saw happening quite a lot when platforms kind of finally around COVID started acting to regulate and deplatform and close groups was because they'd already built communities on, say, Facebook or Twitter, they were then able to A, make themselves kind of martyr figures by saying, look, I'm being kicked off for speaking the truth, and B, say, but don't worry, I won't be silenced in Telegram, Gab, Parler, whatever, these other apps, other messaging apps of various types that exist that don't moderate in the same way. Follow me there, and they've already got this ready-made community who all of them won't follow, but a hardcore will.
Yeah, and I just remember I went along to a QAnon conference in Birmingham, and I was in a hotel that wasn't even the one that the conference was in, and we overheard a couple of people there who were going to this QAnon conference, and they were sort of sheepishly admitting how many Telegram groups they're in, and the experience. I'm on conspiracy theory Telegram, and you cannot be in one group. Once you're in one, you're in 20, you're in 30, and then you're getting bombarded with this kind of constant stream of extreme material, and it's quite easy to see then if that's your exposure to what you think is reality, you're going to start slipping in a more conspiratorial direction.
And I think, actually, if I could just add to that, when we're talking about and thinking about how we measure the size of the movement and whether it's grown or not, that can sometimes be a bit of a confounding factor because there is a probably much smaller than it looks like from the overall numbers in the group, hardcore, who are in all of these groups and who are actually active, and so you can easily try and do some analysis and say, oh, there's this many people in this group and this many, and that shows that's the size of the community. Whereas in reality, A, plenty of them will be researchers and journalists, and B, lots of these people are just in every single group possible. So you can be misled about the size of the movement from that.
Yeah. I'm going to take a question from the audience in a moment, so I'll be thinking. But before I do that, I just want to raise the question. We're talking about a conspiracy theorist. We've talked about how it's maybe not irrational, it may not be delusional, but it's certainly not healthy. When it comes to being a conspiracy theorist, do you think anyone could become the type of conspiracy theorists we're talking about? Not the one who are thinking maybe my partner's planning a surprise party, but the ones who are thinking maybe the Jews are controlling the world. Is it that anybody could become someone like that, or do you think there's some people who are more prone to falling for these conspiracy theories more generally?
I'm tempted to think now maybe this is naive of me, but I'm tempted to think not anybody could, right? You take any kind of explanation about why somebody's a conspiracy theorist, right? A kind of psychological individualistic explanation which says, well, you have certain kinds of cognitive biases, or you take an explanation about the kind of environment people inhabit. All of those kinds of explanations presume that there are people who don't exhibit those biases or don't live in those kinds of environments. So it seems to me that if we take any of the kind of explanations that are currently on offer for conspiratorial ideation seriously, it just falls out of those very naturally that some people are not prone to conspiratorial ideation. Now, we can talk about whether those theories are any good, but it seems to me that if any of those approaches are getting it even nearly right, then it seems that, no, not everybody can be a conspiracy theorist or is prone to be.
Yeah.
I go back and forth on this. I do think there's something to that, like there's differences in degrees, but I also believe that I could probably convince many of the people in this room of a conspiracy theory with fairly little effort. Just because there's lots of ways to tempt people into them. There's lots of ways to make them very plausible, to start with real things and then move along in this kind of way. And also, like, another reason we haven't talked about why people get into these communities is that there's really great research about how these are effectively community-centered narrative games. It's like a giant, if you've ever played a MUD or something like that, it's essentially the new version of that. And so it ties into all of the needs for community. And a lot of us, especially in the pandemic age, are dealing with loneliness. And it takes one bit of bad luck to end up in the wrong group of people who love bomb you while at the same time, like, it's the same question is, like, could anybody end up in a cult? Yeah. Like, I think it just was a little bit of bad luck and the people talking to you at the wrong moment in your life, you could go very, very far in the wrong direction.
Yeah, and that was actually something I spotted when I went to the Flat Earth Convention a few years ago now in Birmingham. I don't know why it's always Birmingham. If there's anyone from Birmingham sort it out, guys. It's a big city. But what was remarkable was over the course of 3 days, pretty much every single speaker who got up on stage as one of the leaders in the Flat Earth movement would say, just innocuously at one point in their talk, I was going through a really terrible point in my life, and then I realised this. Someone would say, I had a midlife crisis, I had a breakdown, and someone left me, someone died in my life, and some major tragedy or trauma happened along the way, and that was enough to give them that little nudge away from reality and to accept what was a false view of the world, because it offered something else. So I will come to a question, I promise, but when it offered something else, what is the something else that conspiracy theories offer to people who are in, as Aaron says, that moment of bad luck, that moment of being down? What do we think people get from being a conspiracy theorist?
Yeah, I think beyond community, there's a sense of safety and security in having a very clear explanation for something. And I think you see that in wellness as well, that if there is something, say someone's experiencing a chronic illness for which there isn't a good medical explanation, or we're not very good at diagnosing it, or we're not very good at treating it, there's a comfort to saying, actually, there is this really clear thing that I can definitely tell you works, or, everything is going wrong, you've been through this awful experience of the pandemic, I can offer you that comforting, intellectually satisfying, with closure explanation that this is how it all works, rather than going, it's a bit of this and something happened, I don't know, it's a bit, like, that's a less secure feeling, even if the thing you believe is horrific. Like, it's more secure.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of justifications across political spectrums. A lot of recurring themes, though, are things like the illusion of control. So if you feel like the world is out of control, this can give you a sense that it's being controlled by somebody, at least, and that you have some control because you've gotten that secret knowledge. So that can be one thing. And another one that I think you often see is a kind of version of a just world theory, where they need to feel like the world is just, and it's clearly not, so there's got to be somebody causing that. And that can often very quickly get you into the white supremacist side of things, because their explanation for why they're not winning anymore is the Jews. So I think those two feelings can often go together, and I want to add, I think there isn't hard data on this yet. I've been talking with some friends about trying to do a study on this, which is, I think there's a somewhat significant correlation between belief in conspiracism and religiosity. And I think it explains partly why the right wing in America, who is highly religious, is also heavily spiraling into conspiracism. And they show a lot of the same features of, like, making people feel part of a community, illusion of control, belief in a just world, etc.
Yeah, I was going to say a version of what the two of these people just said. So there's kind of these cognitively appealing conspiracy theories because they satisfy the kind of need for control. But also I find quite attractive the idea that conspiracy theories sort of give you the kind of feeling of being special and unique because you've got access to information that other people don't have. And there's a certain... I listened to the Flat Earth podcast. They haven't been active for a while, actually.
No, yeah.
Is
that the one that they had an episode with a hollow earther? I think episode 2 was with a hollow earther. Maybe this is
possibly.
a previous one.
Not the good episode of hollow earther.
No, that's a different thing.
But it seems to me, I can kind of hear it in their voices that they feel extremely kind of smug about having this special information, and they've got some very horrible words for people who believe that the Earth is a sphere, words that I won't repeat. But I take quite seriously the thought that conspiracy theories are quite appealing to some people because they give them this kind of specialness because this information's hidden to most.
Yeah, and if I can just second that, I think I mentioned the intellectual dark web earlier. Folks like Brett Weinstein love to do the shtick of, you're my listener, you're special, you figured it out, you're part of the inside, the secret, is revealed to you kind of stuff. And this is exactly like cult leaders. It's literally no different, so.
Yeah. And I think when you talk... Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I think that's a huge thing. I think you get this interesting juxtaposition between both... I think there have been studies to show that there is a kind of correlation between narcissistic traits and believing that you've nailed something that no one else has realised. But also it always strikes me how much a lot of people involved in these movements see themselves as good Samaritans, good people, they care, they were motivated by feeling like something is wrong, like you say with the just world. It's easy to paint people in a very malign way, but very often, people come into it going, well, I wanted to help, and this is all going wrong. So.
Yeah. Well, and just picking up on that's I think it also comes to the idea of control. It does give people a sense that the world is in control. I mean, it's malevolent control, but it's in control. But that also gives them a sense of agency, because if there's someone in control and they're bad, we just stand up against them. We can stand up to them. We can fight them. That's a much more satisfying kind of narrative to have a villain than random chance that your life could go to pot tomorrow because of circumstances completely beyond your control. That's quite a scary idea.
Or even 100% that, but even beyond random chance, even if we are talking about the ways that there are genuine negative things going on in structures, it's much easier to say it's the World Economic Forum than to say it's these very hazy, difficult to pin down, deep structural roots of inequality and distribution of power and things that are really hard to seize onto, but you can seize onto this named organisation.
It's not capitalism, it's Klaus Schwab.
Yeah. And on the narcissism point, you're not supposed to diagnose at a distance, but I think it's pretty obvious that there's a connection between many of the leaders of the IDW spiraling off into conspiracism and the fact that they're very, very clearly malignant narcissists.
Okay, here's that question that I promised I was going to ask. You're very close, Claire, so I'm going to throw it to you.
I love this microphone situation.
The skeptical athletic skills right here.
Right close to the box, I think. You're going to be pretty close.
Better? Yeah,
yes.
Okay. So we are using words like villains and the just world, and it kind of goes back to, if we take a step back, what about fairy tales? Should we think about restructuring fairy tales for kids? Because we bring them up in this idea that, the evil witch will be burned, that good will win. And then, they go out into the real world and they get punched in the face by reality. And then I think it's like, again, not based on any data, but it's like a seeking of this safety and of this clear result that they've been promised their whole life, these expectations that they have. So do you think, is there any link, or how should we kind of approach child rearing in that kind of, from that perspective?
Who wants to pick up on that?
I mean, I will say, and of course I'm going to bring luck into this at some point, I do think that we've seen shifts in the way our culture portrays villains, very broadly speaking, that we've moved away from mustache-twirling villains the more we know about psychology and abuse and such. We get these much more sort of complex characters. I also think postmodernism, broadly speaking, has had an impact on undermining the kind of very simplistic black and white grand narratives that a lot of people, you could argue they may have replaced them with other grand narratives, but I do think there's been a deconstruction of a lot of traditional narratives, which I think is good, but it probably also has created a bit of a void for some people that gets filled with another grand narrative, which might end up being a conspiracy theory.
Does anyone else want to go in, or should we go to the next question? I think there was a question.
Right in the front.
Yeah, right at the front. I threw one right there. Well, can we throw? We'll go here first, and then after you've asked your question, we're going to throw all the way to the chap with his hand up at the back there. But you'll ask your question first. And it'll move on its after you've asked.
Mine is a really quick.
Okay. If Facebook and Twitter disappeared tomorrow, do you think there'd be a decline in conspiratorial thinking, or are they more symptom than cause?
Do you mean like all of social media or just Facebook and Twitter?
You've asked a follow-up question once the box moved, Aaron. This is unprofessional. There's a box for a reason. No. You can ask your question.
Specifically for Facebook and Twitter at the moment.
I do think that there is evidence out there that deplatforming particularly influential people, I think I said this in my talk earlier, if anyone was there, that we've got some quite good evidence from, say, Tommy Robinson being deplatformed, that it does rob people of their influence. And even once you move to Telegram, if you lose that big audience, you lose your ability to raise money, and that can have an impact. But can we answer that question? That's a tricky one. I mean, I think, as we've kind of touched on here, a lot of these phenomena and beliefs are as old as humans, and in one way there's nothing new under the sun, and people have always believed these things, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be curious about the specific form that it's taking now, and to look at what kind of harmful influences these platforms might be having. So if they disappeared tomorrow, I don't think we can say that there would definitely be a huge decline, but I think there probably would be a decline in organised movements, and particularly like coordinated misinformation narratives.
Anyone else want to comment on that?
I would say to some extent the ship has sailed on that. Like if they hadn't had social media to begin with, then yes, I think you would have seen an impact. I think we to some extent overstate the role of social media in this, but it absolutely provides an accelerant. I think one thing that you might see if you had that happen would be a slowing down of the on-ramping of more normie individuals, your parents, into these conspiracy theories, because they're not going to go to Telegram, but like they're going to go to a Facebook group, and that might lead them in that direction.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the idea that conspiratorial ideation has increased because of social media is overstated and simplistic. But I think that there's these really nice ideas called epistemic bubbles, which we all have. That's just kind of our curated feed. So I don't see much from conservatives or anti-vaxxers because I'm just not really friends with those people. But I'm kind of open to it, right? It's kind of accidental that I end up seeing those particular kinds of content. But I think social media, what it has done is kind of facilitate the creation of what are called echo chambers, right? So not only do echo chambers give you a curated set of information, a curated timeline, you only see content from certain kinds of people, they're also self-sealing. So what they do is they discredit any potential outside voices, right? So if you're a flat earth echo chamber inhabitant, if it's any good, if it's a decent echo chamber, what it's going to teach you is that guy from NASA's going to come along in a minute and he's going to say all this stuff. And he's not to be trusted, right? That's part of the echo chamber. And I think that social media has done a really good job of creating echo chambers and discrediting those outside voices before they even get in. So you're kind of invulnerable to being debunked. So I think that's the role that it's played.
Yeah, and I think I'd agree. I think, for me, it sort of picks on stuff that you've all kind of touched on, really, that I think if we moved Twitter and Facebook tomorrow, it's not going to stop the wildfire spread of conspiracy theory, but it will remove some of the on-ramps because, as Aaron says, my dad's not on Telegram, he is on Facebook. He said to me when I was home, I'm not sure I should say this, it's been recorded, it's probably fine. He said to me last time I was home that he'd spent a while on YouTube and he'd found himself watching Tommy Robinson videos, and he'd watched quite a lot of them, and he realised that he was starting to lean towards racist positions. And I've no idea, I mean, a lot of respect for the fact he was able to recognise that and go, and so I'm not going to watch any more of that again, that's awful. And he could feel himself being pulled in those areas. But if Tommy Robinson and that kind of material wasn't on the places where my dad frequently hangs out online, that on-ramp wouldn't be there. It won't stop the people who are already in those spaces, but it also will slow down their ability to talk to one another and force them to talk to each other. So one of the things that I've found, and Rachel, maybe you've the amount of time you spent in Telegram, you may have noticed this too. I found it even when I was spending a lot of time in Telegram conspiracy channels, I was spending a lot of time reading that stuff, and I wasn't reading my normal Twitter feed or even talking as much to the people that I would normally talk to online. And I'm there to research them. If you're somewhere there because you believe, suddenly the only people you ever speak to are the people in these chambers, and the more time you spend in there, the more channels you accumulate, the more people you talk to, and they're the more messages to check, and the fewer amount of hours in the day you spend talking to the real people in your life who disagree with that stuff.
Yeah, I think it can be quite mind-bending, as you say, even when you're there as a researcher or an observer or whatever. And I think through kind of the work of fact-checking and just in general, I think it's a good practice as a reporter and as a person. I always try and genuinely check my beliefs and say, you feel very sure about this, but can you factor in this new piece of evidence? Does that change things? And I think if you make yourself quite open-minded, and then you're getting like, I've definitely had moments where I'm like, oh God, maybe the vaccines are wrong. No.
I had a moment where I was in the local anti-vax group in Liverpool, and I saw a conversation going on about how they found that at all their in-person meetups, their audience was entirely white, and what can we do to appeal to more people of colour? And I found myself going, oh yeah, good on you, it's good to be thinking, no, I don't want to be doing that. So I really had to pull myself back at that point.
On the same note, I recently watched through the Better Way anti-vaxxer conference in Bath, and did a couple of write-ups of that. And as I was doing it, I was messaging Marsh like, I'm losing track of reality. Like, am I the skeptic? Are they the skeptic? Like, it really can mess with your head when you listen to that stuff for extended periods. I also wanted to add, I'm pro deplatforming, I'm pro content moderation. Getting Alex Jones off of Twitter was good. I'm sad it's not going to last. But
Alex Jones on Twitter.
I don't want to ever suggest that we have a clear picture of what the cost-benefit analysis is for content moderation entirely. When you force all of these people off of these platforms and into these other isolated platforms, it's not just that it's an echo chamber. You obviously reinforce their, we're being oppressed mindset. And I would argue they probably increase the risk of, violent escalation, I think.
And yeah, I see people already talking about big fact check in the way they talk about big pharma, and when they see, even if it's not been removed or no one's been deplatformed, but there's just one of those little warning labels that says, hey, fact checkers have said something about this, people will go, big fact check is trying to censor you and suppress your thoughts. And you're like, well, it's very, very difficult to measure how many people you are giving that information to and correcting versus how many people are being entrenched by saying, see, they are trying to control the narrative and they are trying to censor us.
And if I could just pick up, Aaron, you talked about that violent escalation of the deplatforming. There's a thing that I found difficult to deal with, which is once people are ejected from one community or self-ejected from community because they start to believe in something that is quite extreme, they now find themselves in the community of people who are also ejected or self-removed. Once you're there and you come across an idea that is really horrific, it's much harder for you to say, well, I'm going to leave this community behind as well, because where do you go when you've already been nomadic? So by deplatforming and isolating people, do we risk them being less willing to question the other awful ideas they come across because they can't afford to lose another tribe? Anyone want to pick up on that particularly depressing question?
I think that sounds incredibly plausible, right? So the kind of the motivational influences on walking away and taking that cost of losing one community and then turning your back on another one, like the stakes all of a sudden become much higher than they would for you and I turning our back on such a horrific conspiracy theory. So that sounds really plausible to me.
And I think that's why, all of the advice you see about, not dealing with kind of strangers on the internet, but people in your own lives is, if you really can't bear to kind of hear or have arguments about it, to put that aside and just don't talk about it, but try to maintain just some kind of relatively neutral, supportive relationship, because then you're a base for someone to come and talk to. If actually every time you meet, you're like, let's not talk about those things. Let's just, how are you? Let's go for a walk in the park. And you remain, just someone in their life who's quite neutral. They do have someone to come back to when things start to falter and they see things that they're a bit worried and uncomfortable within that community.
Yeah.
How many of y'all are aware that our Speaker of the House was almost assassinated a day ago? Yeah. So I mean, this to me is, January 6th, I think, was an opening act. I think this will continue to escalate in a way that is significant, and I would say there's probably a connection here to Ezra Klein's analysis about why we're polarized. This idea that our identities used to be more complex and multi-communal, and that we've become kind of stacked in our identities, and so it becomes where an attack against one part of that identity is an attack against every part of that identity, and so it just really reinforces this I got to stick with my community. I mean, Liz Cheney Liz Cheney is no longer going to be in the GOP because she wouldn't buy into the big lie about the election. And this is another part of like the numbers about conspiratorial ideation. I don't think they're capturing how much elite individuals are, mainstreaming and using these ideas compared to previous periods.
Yeah. And actually that reminds me, when we're talking about what does the modern conspiracy landscape look like now and how might it be different, that does feel like a shift from people involved believing conspiracies being more likely to be very disenfranchised and not having power, to a shift to it's the people in power who are holding these conspiracies, despite the kind of strange cognitive dissonance of saying the elites are doing this when you're the president or whatever.
Or Joe Rogan.
Or someone incredibly powerful for whatever reason.
I did send the microphone all the way at the back of the room. I didn't just make you hold that. I was actually expecting a question. So we'll come to you now if that's okay.
Yeah.
You have to speak right in the microphone, I'm afraid. So put it right to your mouth.
When you've gone into these Telegram-type conspiracy theory groups that are convinced that the government is covering something up, have you encountered what the reaction is from these members to the idea that the government may be sending an agent into these groups to try and monitor and kind of interact with them, and how do they respond to that idea when it comes up?
And can you bring the microphone, pass it forward after you're done there? That'd be great. Who wants to pick up on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a strange way that, you're creating this sense of a secret society, but these groups are incredibly open. There's a very low bar to entry. And so, for us editorially, if you're going to go undercover in a social media group under false pretenses, there's a big editorial process. It counts as like secret. It counts as being undercover and secret recording. With Telegram, you don't have to be you just join. So there's no bar to entry at all. And so, yeah, they must have. I've not seen that as a massive topic of discussion in these groups, but like they must have considered the fact that there are people monitoring them, especially because there's so much reporting that happens that clearly come from these groups. It's an interesting thought, yeah.
And again, this is an example of where it's not irrational. Our government infiltrated a bunch of leftist organizations and deliberately destroyed them. Speaking for Americans, right? It is perfectly reasonable to believe that government officials have put you on a list and are making sure, and might deliberately try to undermine you, or so you have this, so now you get the rise of false flags and a lot of accusations that any negative event is a false flag. Obviously Sandy Hook is one of the most famous, but the problem is there are real false flags. Putin got into power by staging a false flag, a publicized false flag event. So you can't just sort of knee-jerk deny that these things, this leads to a kind of particularism about conspiracy theories where unfortunately you have to dive into every single detail of all of them, and that sucks, and it's very hard to, turn that into something that can easily help people get out.
Yeah. And so just your question about how they react to the idea that there's someone there who's an infiltrator. I have two experiences of this. One is I spent a long time in the White Rose anti-vaccination movement in Telegram last year. Including, they sent me some stickers through the post because I gave them my address, which in retrospect was not a very good idea. Given that I was then to go onto YouTube a few months later and give a talk about the White Rose, at which point in the Telegram channel it was like, oh, Michael Marshall was here all along. Here he is in Telegram. He was an infiltrator and now he's doing a report on us. That was a bit of a worrying moment. Luckily, they didn't put two and two together with my address, and it's all been fine so far. So far, I mean, I'm not at home right now, so I haven't checked in on the house in the last 48 hours, but this was a long time ago by this point. But in doing so, the leader of the Liverpool anti-vax movement, a guy called Louis, really nice fella, reached out to me, and I'd been chatting to him a bit previously on and off, and he realised now that I was there to report and not to believe in it, and we got chatting, and he ended up leaving the group and joining the Merseyside Skeptic Society. He's a really nice guy. He's genuinely a really lovely, curious guy. He's all the things that we said about someone who's going through a rough time and was struggling to figure out exactly kind of how to see what was real and not. But when he left, or when he did an interview with a local paper in Liverpool, everyone else in the channel was saying, oh, well, Louis was a Fed all along. Louis was a copper all along. He was always a plant, even though he started the group. So we have this kind of this kind of thing of that it doesn't matter how in you were, the second you say, hang on, I've changed my mind, you were always out. You were always a plant and always kind of an infiltrator.
There are a significant number of people who believe that Alex Jones is a plant. So there is no amount of screwed up that you can present. What? Oh, yeah, I apologize. He's obviously just Bill Hicks, undermining everything.
You had a question there still, I believe. You're holding the box. It's made its way to you, so I might as well give the question to you.
It's a quick question. So there's the various different flavours of QAnon, because there's quite a few different flavours. One of the things I've heard about why they are so successful is the way they've gamified spreading the conspiracy. So even the most sane people quite enjoy the puzzle solving and get a serotonin hit from their brain going, oh, I've solved a puzzle. Oh, I've found another little puzzle that's unlocked that puzzle. So what are the panel's opinions on that?
I actually have a story about this. I was debating Jim Rutt, who's one of the sense makers, about content moderation. This was back when Elon first said that he was going to buy Twitter, and now here we are. And Rutt was laying out the people that he would allow on Twitter, and he's like, I would allow QAnon on Twitter. And I was like, that's a terrible idea. QAnon is incredibly dangerous blood libel. And he's like, yeah, but I have some friends who like to do QAnon on the weekends recreationally, Just do a little baking,
Do a little QAnon.
I'm like, that's not good. But yeah, I think for a lot of people, it does start as a game and probably continues as a game.
And I think it taps into two of the things we've already discussed, which is looking for community and the feeling that you have got something that other people don't. And the one person in the UK who I know in my personal life has gone really properly deep into QAnon, who was living on her own, kind of like divorced mum of grown-up children during the pandemic, didn't have work, was generally kind of like struggling, and it was something to do. It was a community, and it was she was already quite into homeopathy, so she had a bit of a feeling of like kind of I get this thing that other people don't get, and it just really is a perfect kind of intersection of all of those like impulses and needs, I guess.
And I don't know that you meant this too formally, but like pushing back a little bit on the different flavors of QAnon. For folks who know The Exorcist, right, there's just the one. There's just the one demon. It's just white Christian nationalism. That's it.
Well, my favorite latest thing, I was interviewing a couple of people who were very deep in the kind of Canadian movement, and I don't know if you guys heard Romana Zidlo. They sort of left her, but they're still very involved, and they sort of said to me, all these people in the media, they're talking about QAnon. There was never a QAnon. There's Q, and there are Anons. QAnon was never a thing. You guys, you've got it all. You're mistaken. And I was like, oh, okay, yeah.
Do we have another question for the audience? I've done a lot on this side of the room. I'm going to go at the back of the room over there, the green hand against the wall. So not the one who's, that one there, next to the guy in red.
Brilliant, thanks. So we've heard loads of things about the theories around what gets people in, what gets people out, but maybe a bit more practical advice. I work in an ICU as a doctor at the minute, and I've just recently admitted a patient who doesn't believe COVID's real, is unvaccinated, obviously COVID positive, and in the ICU for a few days on all the treatments, still refusing to believe that COVID's real. How do I reach this person?
You don't. I think people who get out of this are the exception more than the rule. I think the spiral is very, very hard to break out of.
Yeah, I mean, that must be an incredibly tough experience for you already, dealing with, I'm sure, the extreme pressures of working in an ICU and then having to face that. And I think you can't underestimate how emotionally, personally draining trying to combat some of these things can be, even when you get into a bit of a Twitter spat and you feel like maybe I can slightly help this person, and you go down and down into the really slippery logic and you say, what about this? They go, no, this. It's very draining, and it's not on you completely to do that, I would say. You can just give the best advice you can, and there's no guarantee you would be able to, as Aaron says.
Yeah, I strongly agree with Aaron on that. I just think you don't, right? Because I just think it's the nature of conspiracy theories that they're self-sealing in this way, and that people like you, people in the medical establishment, are just not to be trusted, right? They're just going to be psychologically disposed to not trust people like you, because of course you're going to be pushing big pharma or whatever the story is. So I had some personal experience with this when some elderly relatives of mine are anti-vaxxers. They're also vulnerable, and I spent a lot of emotional energy trying to lay out the science. And then, what was the point of all of that, right? That was a complete waste of my time. But
Yeah, we've sort of seen the collapse of the information deficit model. I do think giving facts can help in certain situations, but coming from the American space, like think about how cult deprogramming works, which is to say it very much doesn't a lot of the time. It's very difficult. Sometimes it involves physically trying to kidnap an individual to try to get them out of that community because of the way the community always sort of closes ranks and reinforces the behavior. Now imagine if that cult is a political party that is one of the two major political parties in your country, and the leaders of it are promoting these conspiracy theories. And Fox News has been laying that groundwork for decades. You're not getting in there.
Yeah, and I think unfortunately by the time someone gets to you, it's kind of it's going to be too late, because the thing that perhaps others can see whether I'm right on this, but my understanding is it only takes time. You need time to be able to do it. You can't do it all in one go. You need to be leading people out gently, because the second anybody feels that they're being confronted, they're being attacked, it's no longer about information for them. It's about identity. This has become an identity position. And therefore questioning it is questioning who they are as a person. And so what you need, unfortunately, I know in an ICU you absolutely don't have it. It must be incredibly hard to deal with the downstream effects of all this stuff. I can't even imagine. But what you need is to be able to have enough space to align with someone's values and to recognize that you're in this, you have these set of beliefs because of the values that you hold. And I can recognize the positivity in some of these values. And then once we are aligned on values, we can just disagree about how to play those values out. But I don't think you're an idiot. I don't think you're evil. I don't think you're deliberately trying to spread a disease and kill people, as they might have heard. You can align first on values and then start to say, now that we agree that these are good traits to have, how is the best to do that in the world? But unfortunately, an ICU isn't the place to do that. So we can't offer you much there, I don't think.
And I suppose without sounding too lame, and I guess this is something that lots of people have said before, but I think the only thing in that situation is just to be kind, which I'm sure you would be anyway. But as you say, not shouting someone down or calling them an idiot, but just, okay, I assume you continue to treat them and you treat them kindly and with respect, and maybe there'll be a small crack of light, possibly, or maybe that will add to evidence that they gather in other places that what they believe might not be true.
And we're all, I think, pretty heavily pro-compassion here. I just want to give a shout out to the folks who do want to call them idiots. I'm sympathetic.
Oh yeah.
No. What I mean is these people are doing something that is deeply immoral. They're unlucky that they're doing it, but they're harming a lot of people, and it's reasonable to be pissed off about that. And it's a lot of psychological energy to put that anger aside and try to help them anyway. Says you see the same thing with cult members. A lot of families just end up having to cut them off because there's no getting them out, and it's toxic to be near them.
Especially when, I guess, their response often is to be very insulting back. So you're I'm being very compassionate, I'm being very kind, and on the other side, they will not be applying that same rule and will be like, you're an idiot, why are you so evil? So yeah, that's tough. It's tough to stand in the face of that.
Nor is it your obligation to do so. No one is obligated to do this work, ever.
I was just about to ask the question. On the back of that, are we obligated to do this work? Is it our duty to engage? So Aaron has pre-answered that question, which is fantastic. Does anyone else want to come in on that? Are we obligated to do this? Is it if not you, then whose duty is it?
I think no individual is obligated to engage, and it's completely reasonable to protect yourself. If you find it's emotionally draining for you, it's stressful, especially if someone close to you in your life, you're absolutely well within your rights to kind of step away. I do think that there is an obligation on media organisations to be properly reporting on this and aware of it and doing fact-checking and doing everything we can, because this is clearly a huge issue in our information space at the moment, and if we're not tackling it, then what are we doing? So I do think that there is a duty there, a kind of wider societal duty. But yes, I don't think anyone is individually obligated, and I think obviously there's kind of the work I do that I put on the BBC, but I also have my own personal Twitter, and I go through phases of engaging and not engaging, and there are some, I think you learn over time, I'm sure you found the same, that you get certain signs of people who will be quite respectful even though you might never agree, or you can see that they're willing to cede certain things, and some people, so if someone's straight off the bat just rude and insulting, I'll never engage. If someone's asking questions or sending me evidence or saying, you say this, but what about this? I will try and engage, but I'll engage to a point. So I'll be like, I'll have a look. Actually, did you know it really says this? Actually, the data, they'll say, well, no, that the author of the paper told you that, but they're clearly wrong. You know, I'll go maybe 2-3 steps down, then I'll draw a line. I won't keep, because I have a personal relationship with that person, and I can't spend my whole life doing that with everyone.
And Emma?
I agree with Rachel that I don't think any individual has an obligation. And also I think it's worth asking, what are you up to here when you're engaging? Because if you're seeking to change minds, I think that's for the birds, really. But I also, and I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist apologist here, but I do think that it's often overstated how much conspiracy theorists are reluctant to change their minds. I think ordinary, everyday beliefs are pretty resistant to change. People don't want their beliefs challenged, right? And when you add in those extra ingredients that you were talking about to do with identity and any motivational influences on those beliefs, you can see why they're held particularly strongly. But, you know, try and convince a scientist that their preferred theory is incorrect, right? They're going to be resistant to belief change as well. So I think it's highly overstated that people with conspiracy theory beliefs and also, spoiler, delusions are especially reluctant to change their minds. I think the other stuff that you mentioned is actually more important to what's going on.
And I'll just add, I see this as very similar to like debating people about wokeness or social justice issues. In ethics, we call this supererogatory, which is to say it's good if you do it, but you're not obligated to. It goes above and beyond what is actually demanded of you. I happen to have a massive quantity of privilege that I am happy to spend on this, but for individuals who do not have as many spoons as I do, just don't. Like, just stay away from this shit.
Yeah. And Emma, just to pick up on the point that you're making there, I think you're saying that conspiracy theorists do change their mind. I wonder to what degree is it that they're willing to change their mind but not their worldview? So, like, I've seen conspiracy theorists shift around their conspiracy theory, and I no longer believe this bit of it, but ultimately the world still is as I thought it was. It's just this little aspect of my worldview. I was the reason I believed in this worldview wasn't because I was persuaded by this story, this fact, this idea. So I can shift that idea without damaging how I actually see the world at all.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my point really wasn't that they do change their minds. It's that the fact that they don't isn't particularly remarkable when you look at the kind of range of human psychology and how belief works. Any kind of belief is pretty resistant to evidence because you got there for some reason, right? And it's quite hard to unpick that reason. But I think you're right that it's easy to change a particular piece of your kind of cognitive economy without, but be resistant to change the whole kind of swathe of background beliefs that got you there. Right?
Yeah, related to the question, as I was prepping for this panel, they of course had to release a study about how political conspiracy theory belief is transitory, is the way that they put it. That like people will hold a conspiracy theory belief in their political views, but then will shift to another belief or something like that fairly quickly. But I think that undercuts the point that for a lot of them, they just shift to another conspiracy. So they just go from, election big lie to, whatever comes next, January 6th, et cetera.
Yeah, and to me, I see that all the time in kind of health and disinformation. And to me, that's not really changing your mind. That's just going with the trend of whatever the latest kind of iteration of it is. So fundamentally, you believe this thing, which is like, the medical establishment is corrupt and drug companies will only ever kind of do bad. And then whatever the latest thing is, whether it's COVID has been overstated, whether it's the vaccine's really harming people, whether it's the latest thing, which is Pfizer lied about transmission, or the next thing will be whatever it is, it's not a change of mind, it's just rolling, and that's why debunking is so difficult and limited, because you can quash that specific, and we will then get really bogged down in the details. We'll go, well, actually, he used this word in this clip, and that technically means this, and that actually, the implication of, well, by the time you've done that, they've moved on to the next iteration, but it's not a change of mind, it's just rolling with the kind of...
Yeah, and if I could just add, I know we're low on time, but from an education background, often I see people saying, well, the solution is just teach critical thinking at a younger age, inoculate children at a younger age. I'm very skeptical about this as an approach for several reasons. Partly, it's a misunderstanding to think that these people can't do critical thinking. There's a study that has found that ethicists like myself are more immoral than normal people because we're better at rationalizing it. We have more argumentation skills.
And anyone who knows Aaron knows that's true.
100% accurate, right? I think it's the same thing here. I think giving people critical thinking skills can make them just better conspiracy theorists. And there's an interesting debate in, like, inoculation. Do you use live ammo with children? Are you handing them real conspiracy theories and seeing how they cope with that? And what are the harms of that? Versus if you don't use that, if you use a more safe approach, will their skills actually transfer into the horrible epistemic environment that we all live in? I'm somewhat skeptical.
I think that's actually all we have time for right now. So please give a huge round of applause for your panel today. Rachel Schraer, Rabinowitz, and Ema Sullivan-Bissett.